Iran's military says its first wave of attacks on Israel since April's ceasefire is now over, although it threatened to resume the strikes if Israel continued attacks on Lebanon. Tehran fired missiles towards Israel late on Sunday, saying it came in retaliation for Israeli strikes on the outskirts of Beirut. Israel responded with its own bombing and earlier this Monday claimed an attack on a petrochemical plant in Iran's southwest. Earlier, US President Donald Trump demanded that the two foes immediately stop shooting. Peter O'Brien has more.
Sirens echoed across Jerusalem and Tel Aviv this Monday morning as multiple waves of Iranian missiles targeted Israel. These pictures show Israeli defenses shooting down some of the incoming projectiles. Iran's Revolutionary Guards claimed they were targeting military assets.
A short while ago, we subjected the strategic air bases Nevatim and Tel Nof to a missile barrage. This operation was in response to the Zionist regime's dawn aggression today against several Iranian radar sites.
Yemen's Houthi rebels also claimed a missile attack on Israel and declared a total ban on Israeli ships in the Red Sea. The tit-for-tat attacks came shortly after Israel bombed a range of targets in Iran. Iranian state media said explosions were heard in Isfahan, Karaj, Tabriz, and the capital Tehran, while semi-official Iranian news agencies also reported a strike on a petrochemical plant in the city of Mashhad. This exchange marks the most serious breach of the ceasefire since it was agreed on the 8th of April. The initial skirmish began when Iran opened fire on Israel in response to the Israeli military's bombing of the southern suburbs of Beirut over the weekend.
The Zionist regime has crossed all red lines and intensified its attacks in southern Lebanon, targeting the suburbs of Beirut. We had already warned that if attacks on the suburbs of Beirut continue, we would attack targets in the occupied territories.
Israel's strikes on Iran appear to have been in defiance of Donald Trump's wishes. On Sunday evening, the US president called on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not to react to Iranian attacks. Tehran now says its operation is over, but warned of stronger attacks if Israel continues to retaliate.
Well, for more analysis on this story, we can bring in Scott Lucas, who's a professor of US and international politics with the Clinton Institute at the University College Dublin. Thank you very much for being with us on France 24. Now, these strikes that we saw there from Iran, can we interpret that as an attempt for Iran to gain control over what happens next in these ceasefire talks by insisting that Lebanon be included in any truce?
Well, throughout the discussions between the U.S. and Iran about a possible end to the U.S.-Israel attacks on Iran, Tehran has linked the two issues. Their proposal, which is still the basis for discussions, makes clear that they would be a ceasefire on all fronts, which is an implicit reference to the Israeli attacks in Lebanon. What we have seen in the past 24 hours, however, I think goes beyond those U.S.-Iran negotiations in that both Iran and Israel are now effectively pushing back against Donald Trump and saying, look, if you aren't going to work with us, we'll take matters into our own hands. So remember that this started on Sunday with those Israeli attacks on the southern suburb of Beirut that you referred to, where you have the administrative and political centers of Hezbollah. Well, the Trump administration had told the Israelis, don't strike, and still the Netanyahu government did. Then, of course, the Iranians launched their first missile strikes on Israel since April, about 30 ballistic missiles. Then, even though Donald Trump told Benjamin Netanyahu, don't retaliate, even though he bragged on TV that he called the shots, Netanyahu doesn't call the shots. Israel then carried out its own strikes, which continued into today. What we're looking at is a continued limbo. We effectively do not have ceasefires, meaningful ceasefires, either between the U.S. and Iran or between Israel and Lebanon. And what we see is that without those ceasefires, both Iran and Israel are going to act and make threats with Donald Trump not being at the center of what's happening, but off to the side.
So if this goes beyond those ceasefire talks, then what is it that the Iranians really want out of this? What's the end goal?
What the Iranians, I think, are doing is reasserting that link between their position and Lebanon to try to bolster their leverage in negotiations with the Trump camp. The Iran play almost worked 2 weeks ago, and that was put the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran controls, in the foreground, make that the center of the first stage of talks. Nuclear issues would not be until the second stage of talks. Trump almost agreed that, but then pulled back because there was pressure from a group in Washington who said, you're conceding too much to Tehran. Iran wants to get the US back into that position where they have to accept that two-stage approach, beginning with Strait of Hormuz and lifting of American sanctions, unfreezing the Iranian assets. What better way to try to do that than to show we still have military capabilities, despite what Trump says, and we can hit Israel as it continues to wage a war in Lebanon. Now, I'm not saying that's going to work. I'm not saying that the Trump folks will now reach that agreement with Iran, that framework agreement, but I think Iran shows that it has a confidence that it doesn't simply have to accept an American ultimatum.
Do you think Iran was anticipating Israel to hit back like it did? And why all of a sudden now announced the cessation of strikes on Israel?
I think they would have planned for the possibility of Israeli strikes. I think you have to, but I don't know if they would have expected to happen, because I think even the Iranians are uncertain right now about the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump in terms of how far Netanyahu would go to defy Trump, which is what he effectively has shown overnight. What Iran has done today by saying, look, we've carried out our strikes, we're now going to pause on Israel, is two things. The first is you get the focus back on those negotiations with the Trump folks, trying to press the Iranian advantage. And then secondly, notice that in that statement, they issued the warning. If Israel hits Beirut again, we will hit Israel again. And the U.S. cannot protect Israel from that. I think that's a show of strength against the Israelis. Now, whether the Israelis simply accept that or whether they thump their own chest and say, look, we're the ones that can hit you. We're the ones that can cause havoc in Tehran and elsewhere. That's what I'll be watching for.
Well, the Houthis also resumed strikes on Israel. Can Iran utilize the Houthis to threaten shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, as it's previously warned?
Oh, Iran is already doing that. I mean, the Houthis are not controlled by Iran. The Houthis are, a group that controls much of Yemen. They act in accord with their own interests, but they're allied with Iran. And we saw throughout Israel's war in Gaza from 2023 that the Houthis would attack shipping in the Red Sea, in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. More than 100 ships eventually were hit, and 4 of them were sunk. Now, with the Strait of Hormuz already controlled by Iran, the possibility that the second strait, the one on the south of the Arabian Peninsula, is also controlled by an Iranian ally, with its effects on the global economy, that I think is the sword of Damocles that Iran might pull out and hold it over the U.S. and hold it over other countries to say, you need this ceasefire sooner rather than later, and you need it on the terms that we have offered.
And do you think that these negotiations, at least as the Iranian president said on social media this Monday, that the Iranians are still engaged in these talks, and are they desperate to make a deal, as Trump says?
The Iranians are definitely engaged in the talks. That's why the Pakistani Interior Ministry was in Tehran this past weekend, carrying a message from the Pakistani president, Shehbaz Sharif, because Pakistan is one of the 2 key mediators, along with Qatar. So yes, Iran is continuing to work with Pakistan, and behind Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, as well as Qatar, to talk about the terms that can be offered to the Trump folks. Does that mean that Donald Trump is the one who has all the cards in these negotiations? Absolutely not. The point here is, once the Trump administration, going back several weeks, accepted the Iranian 14-point proposal, the 2-stage proposal, as the basis of talks, they gave Iran the political initiative. And there was only one way out of that. The only way for the U.S. to avoid discussing on Iranian terms was to carry out ground operations against Iran, and the Trump folks backed away from that option.
All right, Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute. It's been very good to have your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you and your viewers.